Hey listeners, this is Alex, your host of EOA, Entrepreneurs of Asia. After more than a decade of venture building, bootstrapping, scaling, and now investing in Southeast Asia, I sit down with founders, investors, and entrepreneurs who share their hard-earned lessons and stories for the benefit of the Asia ecosystem and beyond. Today, we get to hear from Don Phan. Don and I go way back to one of my first venture building exercises in the region, Zalora, Vietnam. Ever since then, Don has been an institution to the startup and investing community in Vietnam and broadly the region. He's also co-founded Foodpanda in Vietnam, ran his own e-commerce startup in the babies vertical. He's been involved in education tech, helping VCs from sourcing and due diligence, and now helping equity research in the crypto space as well. On top of this, he's a full-time job at a large global tech firm, which we will leave out for now. He's one of those amazing super connectors and has a grind and tenacity unparalleled only by a few others that I would know. I get to catch up with Don a few times a year, and every time I'm learning something new for sure, whether it be mental models, new frameworks, technical ideas, and many more things. This episode happens to have some of the most buzzwords I've ever seen, something I typically dislike, but in this case is very relevant to what's happening in Vietnam. This was the last episode I recorded in 2021, which is a great update on what's happening with crypto and blockchain in Vietnam. We get to discuss Axie Infinity, decentralization versus centralization, Web3, DeFi, and what entrepreneurs and builders should be focusing on if they want to make an impact in the region. This episode is great if you're looking for a broad overview. Some of the ideas may be more specific, but definitely worth your time if you're interested in the space. Personally, I noticed I wasn't completely on my game with my questions or following some of the idea threads, but we will definitely make up for this for the next time Don is back on the pod. If you're ready to learn, let's dive right in. All right, Don Phan, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm good, Alex. It's good to see you.
Yeah, I mean, after a year of planning this, we finally pulled the trigger and got together, right?
Yeah.
So just three quick questions to get to know who we're talking about for the audience, just to know who you are and who we're dealing with. So in your words, who is Don Phan and what is your story?
So I am based in Ho Chi Minh City. Like Alex, I'm Vietnamese American, but I've lived in Southeast Asia for over a decade now. And Alex and I, met each other nearly a decade ago doing an e-commerce startup called Zalora. And I have stayed in the startup industry. I did some other e-commerce startups, an ed tech startup, and now with blockchain startups, this has kind of taken over my life in the last few months. So right now I'm primarily looking at blockchain NFT games, and DeFi projects. And, this is something that's happened relatively recently, but, I guess one of the reasons I wanted to do this with Alex is just kind of give him an update on the Vietnamese startups. So Alex actually got like a front row seat nearly a decade ago, when you and I were trying to bring capital into Vietnam and to do startup clones. And, it was an amazing time to be here back then because we kind of felt like we were part of this first wave. And I guess what I wanted to report to you is that like the second wave is like deeper, more innovative and more creative, and just generally like just really exciting and really cool. I think you and I knew that when we were here, that we're primarily going to be working on clones and trying to implement ideas that have worked elsewhere. And then at some point, there would be an inflection point where like, there were enough people who had the technical resources and the entrepreneurial chops and, most importantly, the capital, to fund these really innovative ideas. So, one thing that has become really apparent to me is that the technical talent in Vietnam, is well above average. And so cryptocurrency, blockchain ideas are taking off here. And there are a couple of reasons. I think one of them might just be the fact that Vietnam had a really strict capital controllers regime. And so a really normal pain point that like you and I had, or that I've had for like 10 years is like, what do you do if you need to get money to pay off your student loans in the US or something?
Yeah.
And this is actually like a reason a lot of people don't come back, because it'd be so difficult. And so, Vietnam ends up being a country where cryptocurrency adoption is very, very high.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to unpack with that good intro. So for first off, then, I think you were talking about how things have changed for Vietnam. I wanted to know on a personal note, right? I felt for a lot of your career, after we built Zalora and you did Food Panda, you were doing your own startups for a long time before your recent gig in corporate with Amazon. And then, do you feel that you kind of should have held on longer to catch this wave, or how do you feel about? Do you think you missed it? Like, this is like a
Oh
kind of
no,
new
no, this
renaissance, right?
this is a different wave. Um, no,
Yeah,
if anything, I think the wave that you and I took part of, you can kind of see you could see why this wave is more exciting, and the benefits. How familiar are you with like the term like decentralization and Web 3.0? Like, have you heard these terms before? Should I take some time to explain?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, let's
Okay,
let's do it for the audience. So I'm familiar with it. I've been talking to a lot of crypto experts, a lot of like, and it's kind of more the past few months. I think this kind of terms come up. So I mean, yeah. So
right, right,
exactly,
right.
how would you define Web 3 versus Web 2 versus even Web 1? I say.
Right. Okay. So here I'm totally going to be cribbing from Chris Dixon. Chris Dixon is a venture capitalist at Andreessen Horowitz, and he's got like a chain of tweets and some essays on his site. And so he's saying Web 1.0 is going to be, the first iteration of the web that was 20 plus years ago. That was, kind of more chaotic and libertarian, and had pretty quirky small communities. Web 2.0 would be
Yeah.
this kind of centralized FANG era where you have these gigantic, powerful, centralized tech companies, like Facebook and Apple, and Google. And so a lot of the critique of um, the the incumbents is about how centralized and how powerful they are. Web 3.0
Yeah.
is really about the power of decentralization, and the way it's relevant for entrepreneurs in Vietnam is really how they raise money. And so, sort of the big story to come out of Vietnam in the past year is this really innovative play to earn game called Axie Infinity, which had been on my radar over 2 years ago, and it was a team I'd been familiar with, and I had seen the presentation and I'd seen their pitches before, but at the time, I did not grasp, I didn't grasp what they were trying to do. I knew that they were doing NFTs and they had like Pokemon creatures and there was a game, but, I didn't realize they were trying to build out like a full on economy, inside of this. And so since they've taken off and become wildly successful, so to give you an idea of like how wildly successful they've been, um, I mean, the big headline is that, they just raised over $150 million from Chris Dixon's fund, Andreessen Horowitz. And they're a pioneer in this play to earn business model. Um,
Well,
one thing,
what time was that was happening? This was
um, I mean,
2000.
I think I knew of the company in 2019.
Okay.
Yeah, and I had seen, what they were doing, and one thing that I guess I appreciate more now is, they actually had enthusiastic users and traction back then.
Hmm. Yeah.
Their first in outside money, their investor was talking about how, when they had 400 users, their users were actually posting videos about Axie on YouTube. So, they had a very strong,
Hmm.
engaged community. Um,
Yeah.
and so one of the big stories here too is that, Axie did not do that well with traditional venture capital investors.
Yeah.
And, there has been this major boom in venture capital financing in Vietnam, that Axie, for the most part, got overlooked by. And,
Yeah.
and what kept the company alive was the ICO process. So the initial coin offering process.
Hmm.
And,
Okay.
there are a lot of different names for this process now. You'll hear TGE, like a token generation event, or an IDO.
Yeah. Yeah.
I actually like the original ICO term because I think it explains what's going on the best.
Yeah.
And I, I think this part's really innovative. And this is a big part of the story for Vietnam. Um,
Hmm.
there are a lot of problems with like fundraising traditionally, going through VC route. And this is basically what you and I went through with Rocket Internet. Rocket was like heavily VC financed. and the startups that I did
Yeah.
afterwards, that, you were trying to go through these VC gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, the ones in Vietnam and the ones in Southeast Asia, other than like, one investor for the most part whiffed on Axie. This could have been a career
Yeah.
defining pick, and they didn't go through it.
Correct.
So Axie goes
Yeah.
through the process of going through an ICO, and they're able to raise, more than 3 million. And,
Yeah.
they were selling the token for like 8 to 10 cents, and, it went above $126. So, you would have
Yeah.
gotten like 120,000% return.
That's pretty insane if you think about where it's at now. And I think what's really interesting is you talk about the macro environment. And I think this constraint comes out of a few things like the government regulation. Like I remember when I was leaving Vietnam, I had to carry a lot of cash out, and I
Yeah.
actually got in trouble
Yeah.
for that. And
Right.
then
5,000.
and this yeah, if I thought it was 10,000 like most countries. So I got whacked, and I got, I had to find a creative way to figure out to get my money out of there. But this sounds very similar to what I've been experiencing recently. Do you remember Justin An from Zalora?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so he recently, I helped do a syndication round with him. So I invested in his current crypto startup as well. And his main users in India have the exact same problem that you're describing. The main reason why they use his company, which is a crypto wallet, to pay their kind of freelance workers, is that capital controls are so strict. So I think there's this very interesting trend in the emerging markets where, there's a real problem that this actually solves, right? And I think a lot of the investors, due to whatever reason, VC, it's very far behind compared to Europe, and even further behind compared to the US, right? So I think a lot of these people kind of miss this. And I think for a long time, just like Vietnam was like, in the shadows of, typical big investors going to Indonesia because of how big Indonesia was.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, a big theme that emerges from this is that, you could have homegrown unicorns from a big enough country like, Vietnam, 100 million people, Philippines, 100 million people, that you don't necessarily need this big TAM story of 600 million people to kind of do what Grab did, right? It's very possible that, you kind of build it from different ways. And I think the main story behind this is that Web3 is kind of powering that in a sense, right? So before we move forward with these kind of stories and the details, why don't you tell us what you think the long-term vision of Web3 is? What does the future kind of look like, from the extension of Web2 into Web3?
Oh, well, yeah, right. Okay. So I guess I'm generally optimistic, but do I have like a very determined view? Do I have a very clear vision of like what the future looks like? Not exactly. I mean, I suspect like some of the big incumbents will get disrupted, and then we'll have probably decentralized companies replace them that will be like potentially even larger in scale. Um, they, I mean, I guess I think I probably have some idea of where this is going on the DeFi side. And I guess one area I'd love to talk to you about
Okay.
is, I know before you did Zalora, you were running a hedge fund, and a lot of the interesting stuff, sort of financial innovation. I think a lot of the smartest people that would have gone to quant funds before are now doing DeFi projects. And
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I guess to go back with the Axie thing before, one thing that's been very clear from my work is that like if you're an entrepreneur in Vietnam now, if you were trying to raise capital 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was incredibly difficult. And one thing is we would ascribe it to
Yeah.
VC investors, like there weren't enough VC investors. Now there are a lot, and you'll meet people who are venture capitalists actively looking for startups now. And it
Yeah.
almost feels like it's too little too late. And so, one question I've asked a lot of VC friends is, do you think the ICO process has the potential to disrupt your industry? And the answer so far has been
Yeah.
unanimously yes. So, so I guess, here we can kind of go through like, and Alex, it sounds like you've invested recently in a company. If you're going through a VC process, there are a lot of problems here. And I think one is just kind of the incentive structure. Going forward, VCs have to defend the pay structure. So if they have like a 2 and 20 structure, like 2% of the assets under management and 20% of the profits,
Yeah.
for someone who is familiar with raising money through ICO or TGE event, the obvious question is, does the VC actually deserve this much? And I think there is going to be margin
Yeah.
pressure on VCs going forward.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it only gets worse from here on out because, in my opinion, is that VC as an asset class is still very small, and I think compared to the whole financial system and how much money and cash has been since QE early days till now, there's more money that's going to pour in, right? So I think that's going to change a lot of dynamics. I think because of valuations are skyrocketing across the board from US to Asia, naturally, and also with the combination of DeFi and crypto and blockchain, that this dynamic does change, and even just the whole I mean, from Series A onwards gets disrupted as well. You have the crossover funds like Tiger and the BCGs coming in, McKinsey's coming in. At the same time, the rise of single GPs is a thing. And, for example, Jason Calacanis pioneering doing media and getting, recurring income from an actual business and then doing investing at early stage, right? So there's so many ways you could slice it now. And then, I think what you're talking about on from the Web3 side is that it gets further even exacerbated of what we're seeing. And, it's just like you said, it's going to get more competitive. I guess it gets more interesting, but I do still think there's room to play if you're on the ground, and at least for early stage, if you are, if you have credibility. A lot of these early stage guys that I talk to, they actually do need help navigating what it's like early days and the pains and the processes. I think that doesn't really change. But maybe for growth funds or later stage funds, maybe that gets a little bit more blurred, where you could skip it. You could do ICOs, you could go straight to direct listings, you could do all these other things that it changes. And places like Vietnam finally get some more light. Other big guys finally see that they could do big things. They come in, and now there's going to be a lot of noise that follows that. So I don't know. With that in mind, though, do you think that Web3 is just another extension of the internet? Why do we need to label it? Isn't it just going to be the internet in the future of how we call it, or
Yeah,
is there a
probably.
reason why I need to split it
Yeah,
off?
and I think you'll know there's mass adoption when basically everyone is interacting with like a decentralized app or a DApp and not realizing it.
Yeah.
And that's probably the way
Okay.
it's going.
So then let's talk about centralized versus decentralized, because I think this is a term that's used often but not really well understood. So what exactly, in your mind and your words, is a decentralized internet, and how does that compare to what we're seeing now?
Right. Okay. So like, I guess this is the big conceptual thing.
Yeah.
If it has to go through a central clearinghouse, if it has to go through a central company, it's centralized. And so, well, kind of
Okay.
the technological breakthrough with Bitcoin is that you could have trustless transactions, and
Yeah.
because of a proof of work system, you could confirm that you don't have a double spending problem. That
Hmm.
someone could send you money and you'd receive it, and you're good to go. Like, you don't need a central clearinghouse um, to validate this. And that one insight can be carried over to a lot of different domains. And I think I think Alex, you were an economics student in uni, right?
Yeah.
Right. So one idea is Coase theorem. And so the idea with Coase theorem is like the coordination problem of the company. So why does a company ever hire anyone directly? Why don't they just use 100% part-time consultants? And
Hmm.
the idea with Coase is that there's transaction costs. And so one reason
Yeah.
you centralize and you actually hire people and bring them in-house is that it just lowers communication transaction costs. And so
Yeah.
on decentralization, this is going to be this is trying to take that idea to its limits. Can we have a decentralized organization and still work effectively? And so the people that are pushing the boundaries are trying to create decentralized organizations. And I suspect it's going to be,
Yeah.
I suspect there's going to be a lot of innovation here. Right now, I think people are getting used to working remotely and in different cities,
Yeah.
but this could potentially accelerate that trend.
Yeah. So I mean, I think you're really focusing on the political aspect, right? Because it's like, how many individuals or platforms control the actual computer systems or network that the internet is made up of, right? But I mean, from a from a actual physical standpoint, we're talking about, these are still clusters. I mean, albeit, maybe big clusters are sitting in the US, big clusters are sitting in Europe, physically where the data gets sent, though, right? So
Right.
from an actual, structural standpoint, are we still not in a decentralized kind of internet? It's just that legally, a few platform players are a clearinghouse, but that's more of a legal structure, right? But say if I split it in half, does it still really run? To I think to a certain degree, yes. Or am I wrong in thinking this way?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the other thing I should tell you is that, like, up until recently, I was like a fairly big crypto skeptic. And so one thing that
Oh,
people will
really?
point to, yeah, yeah. And one of the really salient criticisms is about how centralized mining for Bitcoin became, and
Okay,
the amount of power that the Ethereum Foundation has within Ethereum. And
exactly.
and so you can push this idea, really hard, like with any of these blockchain companies. Is the company itself too decentralized? If a company has, like, more than 50% of their employees in one city, in one office, is that truly a decentralized organization? I'm
Correct.
more than
Yeah.
happy to let founders push it however they want if they think it's effective for the organization. Because, if you hire the best engineers
Yeah.
throughout the globe, that could work if you can find a way to lower transaction costs.
Well, I mean, and I think that's one of my thoughts too. Is that as the tech develops, you build it around. I mean, this gets a little bit philosophical, but you build it around human nature and the needs of social structure. Like it's the tech will reflect that. So in that kind of sense, I don't see how it's possible to be fully decentralized, especially when you start accounting to the fact that you have a big gang of governments who wants to probably be involved in that somehow. Which means to some extent you need to be centralized, and that also leads into the other points of permissionless and trustless. At some point, for this to work, you have to centralize identity, right? And centralizing identity is also, goes against the tenets of, European and American historical context of, not wanting to give up privacy, right? So I struggle to see, what exactly does this decentralization really mean? Other than the fact, maybe from the political standpoint that you said, yes, not necessarily, from a platform playerless and you don't need permission, but I don't, I still think it converges at some point where you get benefits of scale by clustering things together, and then at some point you still need to also connect to different clusters, which means there's going to be another layer, right? A digital layer, just kind of like when, Web 1 with Cisco was being developed, right? They needed to send data packets between mainframes between East Coast and West Coast,
Right.
but they needed a router to kind of solve that, right? So
Right.
essentially what we're doing is that the digital version of this. So I don't really see how we fully decentralized. It gets a little bit more decentralized, but it's, I don't see it as being like this be all end all, like, completely power to the people and destroys the governments. I don't
No,
know
no,
what's
no,
your
no.
take on that.
No, yeah, no. I mean, if anything, like, because so much wealth has been created or transferred recently.
Yeah,
One of the things about like investing and buying in these like crypto assets is that, like, one concern is it seems to disproportionately benefit the early adopters, or almost too much so. Well, you're asking kind of about the regulatory side. Hillary Clinton got some headlines
yeah,
a few weeks ago about, saying that this could be destabilizing from a macro view, and I think that's right. Yesterday I was reading the
I think
IMF
so too.
blog. I was trying to see what the IMF is thinking about this stuff, and they had a pretty
Yeah,
boring boilerplate web post about how there should be international coordination about this, and I think this is like, in terms of an international coordinated response to cryptocurrency and decentralization, I don't think it's gonna be very effective. I think countries
yeah.
have very different incentives here and are going to have trouble coordinating amongst themselves. And I think it's going to be an HR problem too. I think they're going to struggle to find um, people who are kind of like hip to what's going on.
Well, let's put a pause on that, and let's jump into, if you're an investor or if you're a builder at this point, how are you seeing that you should partake in building up, what should you be solving for, Web 3 to be realized?
Oh, sure. Okay. That's kind of a cool question. Um, so I read a lot of white papers like every day, and, so let me, I guess, tell the audience. So white papers are these documents where you kind of outline what you're trying to build, and you can think of it as like kind of a sales pitch, but also like a manual on how you're going to build the company. And so I read a lot of these every day, and I read them seriously. So if you're a founder that's treating this like homework before you list your token on a public exchange, I hope you're listening and I hope you take this seriously. There are people like me who treat this like equity research. And so, so part of my job is I'm basically the equity researcher for, pretty decentralized funds. There are guys in Europe, there are guys in the US that are looking for projects in the US, in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. And, I'll try to read everything I can. And if I can actually interview the participants, I will. So
Yeah.
I guess let me go back with the ICO term. The reason I like the name is that I think it gives you a good idea of what they're trying to build. Because ICO sounds like IPO, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So an initial public offering, you've got to go through layers of typically need to have a company that has audited financial statements, has been around long enough as to where they've got revenue and income, and maybe they're not profitable, but like there's some history there. And then you've got to go through auditors, bankers, investment bankers, and lawyers before you get on an exchange like the NASDAQ or something like that. And so the NASDAQ itself would be a centralized exchange. The problem with this process is that like there's a lot of middlemen, right? There's a lot of middlemen that you've got to go through, and you may need money much earlier in the process. And so this is why the ICO process is so incredibly disruptive. It's disruptive for early stage and all the way up until pre-IPO stage, I'd argue, because it addresses these problems if you're a founder. If you're a founder, you need liquidity right away. And so on the flip side, so the other thing I would tell founders right now that are going through this process is that like it's an incredible source of liquidity. And you're seeing these founders in Vietnam who were able to raise $4 or $5 million. And they probably couldn't have 6 months ago. They probably couldn't have a year ago.
Yeah.
But
correct.
now they're going through this process and they can do it. On the flip side, once you raise that token and it's floating on the public markets, you're essentially a publicly traded company.
Yeah.
And so you've got these problems that like, if you've got internal spats, like if you've got a problem with your co-founder and your co-founder and there's something wrong, like, you miss an important development deadline, or, one of your systems gets breached or something, it's very possible that, your price is going to drop due to insider trading. And so, so these are things that like, founders here are starting to realize. It's like, wow, I raised all this money and I want to do good to my investors, but, the price is rocking up and down and I'm getting flamed by email, Twitter, and Discord. So, it creates liquidity, but it introduces all these other problems that really before the only people that would be familiar with these problems would be later stage startup founders who were like Series D, thinking about doing an IPO. And the trend before this ICO process was that like, later stage startups were delaying public listings before. And one of the arguments was that Sarbanes-Oxley had just made it too hard for companies to list, that the auditing requirements were just too much. And so on the ICO side, on the ICO side is that this is like basically a deregulated market. And because it's a deregulated market, there are going to be fewer protections, but things are going to move a lot faster. And so that's what it's like to be a founder. Alex, as a former hedge fund guy, I think the area you'd be really interested in would be on the DeFi stuff. And so, one of the areas where there's been a lot of technical advancement and progress has been in automated market makers, AMMs. And so the most cutting edge technologies matching supply and demand, it's not going to be on, traditional brokerage accounts. When you're buying US stocks and mutual funds, a lot of those companies that have been around, in Web 2.0, they have not really kept in touch with the technology. And so, if you're trying to buy traditional stocks and bonds in the US, you'll kind of notice that the platforms are really clunky and like the trades don't execute as fast as they should. And
correct.
I think one of the criticisms is because we've allowed these financial companies to consolidate. And so, they're getting scale through consolidation, but they're not necessarily investing in IT infrastructure and keeping up to date. And so the people that would be running that kind of fintech plumbing they're operating in the DeFi industry now.
That makes so much sense. I mean, like essentially what you're talking about is a more efficient financial system where it's less prone to actual corruption and collusion, right? So I think that's like a lot of big problems with these, centralized clearinghouses. They bring the efficiencies, but it's also because it's power centralized. A lot of these kind of problems of corruption occur. Like for running the books, front running, or whatever the case, or it's just the tech is just slower, right? So it's just, I mean, I was talking to,
I'll just narrow it down to the speed, right? Like the speed
yeah,
of clearing
yeah,
transactions is
yeah,
incredibly antiquated on these old
correct,
platforms. So the thing I'll say too is that, like, if you're meeting these startups that are pitching stock trading apps, but they're not crypto guys. They typically will not talk about this kind of technology. They're not talking about
yeah,
automated market makers. And it's always kind of
yeah.
curious. It's just like, okay, you guys are running exchanges, but that's kind of not the story you're telling.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a story. I recently met up with my friend who's in New York. He used to work for, I think, JP Morgan back in the day when we were still like, university, or you were just graduated then. He was a portfolio manager for high frequency trading. And he was telling me how they built their models. And it's just literally a string of if statements and a bunch of, if this variable does this, if this variable does that. It's nothing really that crazy or complex, but it's just, throwing probably raw compute power to run those really complex kind of, algorithmic trading. So essentially, it's not what I imagined. Like you always hear the stories of, quantum physicists and statisticians with PhDs building these kind of models. To a degree, there probably is this, but it's for a bulge bracket bank who is doing that, it's not that complex. And then if that's the old world of technology that's still kind of running or being layered on top, you're right, they're missing this whole opportunity of even further efficiency. And for maybe they have an interest not to do that, right? So it's something that's going to be fully disrupted. So that being said, I think in between the lines, like from a trading perspective, you're right. There's something to be gained from financial trading and liquidity, and also the pain points of probably fundraising is what you would be looking at, I guess, if you're building. Then is that correct?
Well, I'm Alex. Let me ask you this. Isn't it weird when you use one of these traditional apps that, like, you're basically trading New York hours,
Yeah,
right? Like
correct.
8 to 4.
Yeah,
Why?
correct.
Why?
Yeah,
Why not
there's no
24
reason
hours?
to. Yeah,
Yeah,
correct. At this point in time, there's no need to.
it makes no sense whatsoever. This is just like
Yeah.
a weird, antiquated custom that they should get rid of immediately.
Well, then, what follows then is like, what exchange do you think is positioned to replace that? Is that going to
Yeah.
be like a Coinbase or something, or?
Well, okay. So the criticism of Coinbase is just too centralized.
Well, I think we've gone full circle, right? That's my point is like, it's very hard to get away from this kind of centralized idea, which I guess that's the whole Jack Dorsey and Andreessen, I don't know, feuding. I mean, do you want to comment on that or no?
Oh, look, Jack can do no wrong. I mean, he built one of the major platforms that people who are building are using. Like, Twitter is a major platform.
Yeah,
He can say
correct.
whatever he wants, and he can be totally wrong, and I'll be totally grateful because he built that platform.
True, true, true. Okay. Do you have any take, or have you been reading anything of how this, how does the metaverse fit into Web3, or no comments on this?
Right now, I think of it as primarily gaming. I mean, I think,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, gaming is kind of the frontier here. And I think, there
Interesting.
is kind of a full on metaverse. Like, I just got pitched this idea twice. It's weird because, you get kind of hear the same ideas over and over. And
Of
one
course.
was kind of
Yeah.
like, let's create an office metaverse. Let's create like a professional metaverse. And,
Interesting.
and look, in the future, I think we're going to have something like it, but my guess is it doesn't get built directly. My guess is it gets built on a game, and then the professional people come in, like kind of the suits, like the lawyers, the auditors, the bankers come
Yeah.
in once the game is like gigantic.
Well, interesting that you say the on ramp is gaming. That's a big media narrative. I recently had another podcast with my bunch of friends where one of my friends' take was that the on ramp will be remote work, right? Because if you think about how the internet was developed post World War II, comes from the government. Government has to fund everything first, infrastructure wise. And the first layer of Web 1 is actually these giant corporates in the East Coast trying to communicate with personal computers in the West Coast, right? So the on ramp of actually the internet actually is a corporate. And if you really think about it, Web3 and decentralization, the real bulk of what matters the most and what everyone does every day is going to work, and that's logging in to a remote workspace, right? So would you say that the on ramp could be work or gaming versus gaming, or do you think that's not really good when you think about how metaverse unfolds?
I think the on ramps for gaming are still the easiest.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's the big one. The other thing too is like kind of the suits. Takes it takes a lot to get them on the other side. I think they're not convinced yet.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair
So
enough.
this is not necessarily an idea that I'm like super keen about just yet. Like that one seems like a little too early.
Oh, well, you said the same thing about crypto earlier, right?
Oh yeah. And I could be totally wrong here, but in
Yeah.
general, um, I think I'm kind of keen on games because I think that's
Okay.
the people in the game industry have thought about this the most, and
Yeah.
the kind of the rabbit hole I've gone down recently is like
Yeah.
game economist. So like this is
Yeah.
supposed to be like a new position in the future, and so whenever I'm going through white papers and I'm talking to these founders, I will ask them, who is your game economist? And
Mm.
they usually point to the CFO or the lead tech person.
Yeah. So, with this in mind, then, given the Web3, given the metaverse, how does blockchain and NFTs actually fit into this picture?
Yeah. So I guess we can talk more about game economics here. So in the play to earn model that Axie pioneered, they figured out, and it's still, I guess it's still not clear. I think this was not the original aim, but it was a feature that turned into a big part of the game. Um, yeah, I think they have like 3 million daily average users, and like nearly half of them are in the Philippines. And, some of them are
Yeah.
villagers who are living off of SLP, which is one of the three Axie tokens. And they've been
Yeah.
able to earn it. It's actually been a liquid currency that they can use. Um,
Hmm.
this this is like a use case that's actually worked. And so a lot of people have been trying to copy it. But there are all these macroeconomic consequences that happen. And so you actually need like a very thoughtful person designing the economy. Axie has
Yeah.
the benefit of having really smart visionary founders. And one of the guys, the chief growth officer, Jeff, he actually studied economic history at Yale and wrote his senior thesis
Mm.
about economic history and Alexander Hamilton. So, his
Mm.
thought about macroeconomics way more than the typical gaming founder. That being
Yeah.
said, this is so new that they disastrous decisions that affect millions of people. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of exciting. And I think we'll learn a lot about macroeconomics through virtual games. And so,
Hmm.
Alex, as a hedge fund guy, I think the way to think about this is that like, hedge fund guys will do Monte Carlo simulations.
Yeah.
If in the real world right now, central bankers are relatively limited to past experience or empirical evidence.
Correct.
Now, in virtual games, we have the equivalent of Monte Carlo simulations.
Mm. It's a very fascinating way to think about it. I mean, are hedge fund guys actually engaging in this kind of way to think about it? And that's just what do you think this is why they're pushing more investments to diversify into the startup and VC area?
No, I mean, I think if you're a smart VC investor or hedge fund guy that's looking to invest in game economies, you should be
Yeah.
thinking about the underlying economics, and you should be asking teams hard questions about how they view the economy. And one thing I'll say is that the people in the crypto universe tend to have a deflationary bias. Like these are people,
Yeah.
I mean, a big part of the community, their macroeconomic views are like gold bug. The people that came in through crypto to Bitcoin, who are like up in arms about the Federal Reserve printing like a ton of money. Those are
Yeah.
people who are not very keen on like printing money as a solution. Um,
Yeah.
whenever you have economic problems.
Yeah.
I worry that this is going to negatively affect games that hit it. So I suspect that
Mm.
there are going to in the future quite a few very successful play to earn companies um, that make incorrect macroeconomic decisions. So maybe they'll do the equivalent of like raising interest rates when they shouldn't. They'll inadvertently
Mhm.
exacerbate a recession. And so when that happens, the
Interesting.
players will go to another economy. They'll go to another game.
Okay. It's so you're saying there's going to be a real world effect of monetary policy and these kind of games that have their own economies.
Yeah.
I don't, how does exactly does that work if they're not really connected?
What's not connected?
Well, because you're telling because I mean there's two separate kind of fiats, right? So one supply is not connected to the other supply. So why are they being affected by each other?
Give me an example. What one supply and what other supply? What
Well,
currency you're
so
talking
like
about here?
the US dollar, right? So the
Yeah,
Federal Reserve prints the money through bond, open market operations. So if they want to affect the economy, because the main point of the Federal Reserve is to have price stability, long-term job growth, inflation. Or at least traditionally, I mean that kind of has morphed to something different today, where somehow stock is involved in this. But essentially,
right.
that's the role, and they do this through interest rate, manipulation. But so, what is your comment? How does that connect to a world of a big gaming universe where people are plugged in with different currency, different economics, or like how are they connecting to each other? How are they affecting each other?
Yeah. So if you have a game that has big enough scale, and I think this is going to happen very soon, that we'll have a game that has market caps of above $10 billion, and we'll have
Yeah,
5 to 10 million people playing on them every day. Um,
yeah,
you will have to make choices about your currencies. And so, Axie Infinity has three currencies. And,
yeah.
I will ask founders, what's the ideal number of currencies? How many currencies do you have? What's the relationship between the currencies? Will you have a fixed exchange rate between the currencies? And, what will you do if transactions on your platform go down? And
Yeah,
so these are all central banking questions. So the head
yeah.
economist of the game is the central banker for the game. And you will have to make decisions that react um, to the real world economy.
So essentially, what I mean, if we're to look at this, the whole big picture of Axie Infinity, it's pretty much one of the best implementations and manifestations of everything we've been talking about, Web3, blockchain, everything, right? It's probably one of the best examples, right?
Yeah. I mean, right now, I mean,
Which,
that's the economy that people are trying to copy. But what I'm trying to put
yeah,
forward is that, like, they created their economy under very specific circumstances and for their specific needs. If you're trying to build a
correct.
game like that, you will have different needs, and you should think about the economy differently.
Yeah, okay. Um, what one of my friends thinks the reason why Axie Infinity is massively successful is because it's just another form of legalized gambling. Would you agree to this statement?
I mean, that seems like a very, I try not to take moral stances about these kinds of things. Like, I
Yeah,
think if you start, like, I think a lot of innovation happens in markets that get poo-pooed or looked down upon for very judgmental reasons that I think are counterproductive. So if you say
yeah,
like, oh, that's a bubble, that's speculative, that's a frivolous game. So I'll give you an example. So one question I get a lot is like, are we in the middle of some crazy gaming bubble in Vietnam? And it's hard for me to
yeah,
say, it's hard for me to say that this is a bubble because it's very likely there's going to be at least three breakout games. And so if you fund
yeah,
150 games here, if three of them become a big deal, this was not a bubble.
yeah.
And so I think there's going
That's
to be at
true.
least three big ones.
Well, the other big one already is the company in Vietnam that did the tapping game on the pads, right? I forget the name of the
Right?
company.
Flappy Bird. Yeah.
That's also, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, which was already a unicorn, right? I think.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think you already have two ones. So I mean, it's already a serious contender. It's already on the map. I mean, I think this just also points to the power to the decentralization, right? It's kind of like a proof point, and it's just moving along that kind of direction. Can the Vietnamese government have a say of how this shapes out, or have a way to interfere or regulate or be a part of it?
Right. So this is the question. This is what I mentioned earlier about the IMF. The IMF's writing here.
Yeah,
As a regulator, this is very, very difficult to regulate. One reason I pointed to earlier for as a catalyst for crypto adoption in Vietnam is that Vietnam has capital controls. Vietnam has a very good reason to have capital controls. And Alex, I think are you sitting in Malaysia?
yep, Malaysia.
Yeah, so Malaysia has the most successful capital controls case study here. During the Asian financial crisis,
Yep.
they installed capital controls, and the IMF kind of had to grit their teeth. And it sounds like there was some internal debate where there were people within the IMF who actually supported the decision too. But it went against like kind of free market doctrine. Um,
Hmm.
and now, the reason you would have capital controls is that you were worried about defending a fixed, a fixed rate currency regime. And so
Yeah.
if your currency is pegged to the dollar, in order to stabilize your currency, you need to have massive currency reserves.
Yep.
And if you're worried that like, the dollars or other foreign currency in your market are going to suddenly leave your economy, you probably need to put up capital controls. And so Malaysia did this, Vietnam did this,
Yeah.
and it worked. And so,
Yeah.
Vietnam has good reason for doing this. And one thing, if you have uh, a fixed rate currency regime, you typically want to have at least 4 months of foreign currency, so you can intervene in the markets and like use dollars to buy oil. Right? If you run out of
Yeah.
dollars to buy oil, you're gonna probably have a financial crisis. Uh,
Correct.
and so those are good reasons. Those are good, legitimate reasons, and that is what the IMF will tell you if you're a central banker in Hanoi, right?
Yeah.
But if you're an entrepreneur on the ground, if you're a business person and you actually need to be able to, exchange VND for euros and dollars, it can be very, very tricky. And so,
Correct.
and so if you were a central bank regulator, and you start noticing this leakage, that the capital controls
Yeah.
become gradually less effective every day, that's a problem. And I actually I can't think of a good solution yet, because this is where
Yeah.
decentralization is a very powerful technological idea, and that like it's going to work
Yeah.
so effectively. And this is basically what Hillary Clinton was saying. And so, yeah, I agree with Hillary
Well,
Clinton.
yeah. Well, China has tried to do this, right? They had some form of a ban of cryptos, right? And I mean, like for authoritarian regimes to maintain control, they need to have total control over everything, right? So I mean, I don't know how they would enforce it. If they see it going on, they don't like it, they don't want to part of the system. They could just jail these people, right? They could jail the guys that the actual talent needed to kind of power it. Or you're saying that's not possible? It still run from this, decentralized outside, but give access to Vietnam somehow. Still, you think so? It's even if there's no way to physically stop this.
Yeah. So there's a hedge fund analyst that I really like named Lynn Alden. And so she makes the point that when China cracked down on Bitcoin mining, and I think at the time, China was doing like 40% of the mining globally for Bitcoin.
Yeah,
The miners moved to other parts of the world. A lot of them moved to the US, and the system worked fine. And so,
yeah,
this would give you an idea of how strong the technology is for decentralizing. So that like, China, a central authority in Beijing is trying to make this illegal, and it does not affect the Bitcoin network all that much.
correct. So I mean, effectively, you would have to believe in the idea of symbology, then, that this does change the nature of how government communities form, right? You could create a state digitally, and you will need less reliance on
Well,
governments in the future, right?
well, so Alex, the right. So I think the political science view here isn't so much the military, but the currency, right? So
Yeah,
the thing we had before, the startup cost for currency is much lower than what you and I were taught in college. So the kind of the narrative that we may have learned
correct.
is that like, you want to create your own currency, you need to build a country, build a military, have a bunch of guns protecting your central bank. And
Yeah,
and
yeah,
now that apparently is not true. Like, it takes much less than that.
yeah. So you can create an idea of a state or what you value together as a group of individuals, but you still can ignore the fact that you still need to tie this to the physical aspect. I mean, you would need some type of, I don't know, you still exist physically, geographically somewhere, right? And I know there is a physical aspect of power in military too, right?
Right.
How do you reconcile these two
What are you asking me to
existing?
reconcile?
I mean that governments essentially will want to retain control and power physically through military force and stuff, but then
And
how does that like look?
that's what fiat currency works.
Yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
that's why fiat
So
currency works. And the cryptocurrencies are, I would argue, based on fiat currency.
yeah, okay. If one wants to get involved then in the Vietnam ecosystem, whether it be Web3, DeFi, crypto, whatever, like what is your advice of getting involved in Vietnam startup scene now?
Oh, I mean, it's a great time to build something. I mean, I think it's kind of always a good time to get made.
Yeah,
Markets are really dynamic. There's a lot you can
yeah,
do. If you like, if you like games, this is like an amazing time.
yeah,
If you like the game industry, like definitely, this one kind of feels like a gaming renaissance.
yeah,
And so personally, when I'm looking at games that I would play myself, I'm looking for games that 12-year-old Don would have played. And so these tend to be like very
Mm.
violent games that you would, that our mothers would try to take away from us.
Correct.
It's,
Yeah.
those are the games I'm looking to back. So I'm looking for things that
Yeah.
look like, I would have played Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Tekken, for hours and hours. And I'm looking for like
Correct. Yeah.
decapitation, a dragon biting your head off from Mortal Kombat. So
Yeah.
so s- Grand Theft Auto was like another game that was like really, that I
Correct.
really liked. Um, and are you familiar with Yield Guild games, YGG?
Um, I mean, maybe I am, but not that specific phrase. I'm not as familiar with.
Okay, so I'll put my Rocket Internet hat on because I've been thinking about Oliver Samwer a lot recently because of YGG.
Okay.
So YGG is a startup in the Philippines. It's very clever. The founder
Yeah.
Gabby realized that he could make money by buying Axie NFTs and then getting scholars who are basically players,
Hmm.
recruiting players from Filipino villages, training them up, buying their Axies for them, teaching them how to play. And, they're earning SLP and they split the SLP earnings 70-30%.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
so, Gabby actually, YGG received $5 million from Andreessen Horowitz. The last I heard, they had 5,000 scholars. And so they have
Hmm.
5,000 players um, who primarily play Axie, but they have access to all these other games. And so, because there are so many of these blockchain NFT games getting funded 4, 5, 7, $10 million, this creates demand as to where, look, some of these games are not going to succeed. Some of these games are not
Of
that
course.
good. Some of these games, it's going to be a miss. Like the investors just back the wrong team, or just bad luck happens with startups. It's not fraud. It's just about just bad luck. Uh, and
Yeah.
and so what they've created is kind of like artificial demand, and so
Hmm.
YGG has its own clones. So there are all these guilds that will recruit players, and and so now these players and these guilds have access to the new games, and so they can look at the new games and then get immediate feedback. So you
Yeah.
can think of them as like a uh, instant market research. And so if you're Gabby and you're YGG and you
Yeah.
have, 5,000 players and let's say 2,000 are dedicated to Axie, you could set aside 200 players and be like, hey, let's test 5 new games and let's see
Correct.
let's see which game reacts, gets the best reaction from our scholars. And then we can go
Hmm.
buy that coin or we can go buy that game. And so for me, when I'm looking at the white
Yeah.
papers, one of the things I'm trying to figure out is this game fun enough to play for 20 hours a week?
Yeah.
Would a 12-year-old Don want to play this game 12 hours a week or 20 hours a week?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a very good point because I mean, I've been visiting some of my old games. You know, Diablo 2 Resurrected came out, and those were the games that I played too much in high school. Why I didn't go to better schools and whatnot. But I think that whole point. I think your idea of on ramp of gaming makes does hold some credence because it's the only thing that you would spend nonstop hours being addicted to it, being plugged into it, and with the advent of microtransactions, it's just so easy to spend hundreds, thousands of dollars on things that exist digitally. So, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. But with that being said, I guess my last question then is that what the plan is? So, are you going to be focusing on building
No,
a
no, no,
game,
no, no.
investing,
Uh,
or
uh,
what's the plan? What's the plan going forward?
oh yeah. So I mean, I'm like I mentioned earlier, I'm doing equity research for um, some investors. I help with some projects. Because I've read so many white papers. Now I'm like actually helping some
Yeah,
projects that I like the team. I like what they're doing. Um, and so I'm actually like helping with white papers. I've
correct.
read and I'm now writing a lot more. And so, one of
Okay.
the things I would tell founders that when they're putting together their white paper, really use this as an opportunity to think about your vision and how you're going to execute and implement your plan. And don't treat this like homework. Like take this pretty seriously. When you're writing a white paper, you're trying to address 3 constituencies. You're trying to address your future investors, your future colleagues, who
Yeah,
are probably employees that you're going to hire, and the
yeah,
future players that are going to play this game. And so the idea is, how do you get all
yeah,
three involved? how do you get your future investors, colleagues, and players involved? The guilds
Yeah.
here kind of blur the line, right? They blur the line between
Yeah.
investors and players. And so guilds like YGG, you should be thinking them as investors and players, and you will need to, kind of address their concerns and interests. And so, this is a great time to
Yeah.
do it. And then, for a reader like me who really deeply cares about the economic questions, I want to get a sense that the founders are not just copying blindly, but are thinking about ways to improve and optimize economic systems, game design, and just making the game as fun as possible. Because at the end of the day, that's probably the
Yeah.
most important thing.
Well, I think you're just speaking to one of the most important tenets of building early stage startups. And I think we alluded this talking about Axie Infinity with one of the founders who went to Yale, is that they actually have thought about it deeply enough and have actual clarity. I think a lot of these people, some of these people will be lucky where it's kind of like this big wave that they just ride. They just happen to be lucky, but they actually didn't really think about it. So there's those cases where people become successful anyway. But I think the ones who really make the profound changes are the ones who actually know what they're solving, even if it's wrong, because with that clarity, you know how to pivot later on. And that's just like you said, it's not homework. You actually have to, you're not trying to be caught up with the noise and like you actually know something fundamentally about the technology. You actually know something fundamentally about how the economics work, and you're actually building something that creates the actual value at the end of the day, right? So I think that's a very good point. It's just one of the tenets of building early stage startups to get actual traction. And even if you don't get the traction, you mess up, at least you had the clarity of know how to pivot the company later on. So it's just all around just makes you a better founder, I think. So it sounds like you're more of leaning towards being an investor with the potential of joining one of these companies one day. Is that how I hear it?
I mean, I think for the next few years, whatever I'm going to be doing, it's going to be, um, yeah, it's going to be blockchain related. But hey, can I tell you about the DeFi stuff? Because I think the hedge fund guy and you will really
Sure.
like this stuff. Okay, so
Yeah.
the DeFi stands for
Listen.
decentralized finance, and as I said earlier, a lot of the really smart quant guys that would have in the last 15 years would have maybe, let's say, gone to a quant fund. The ones that are in crypto are building products and services on crypto that are amazing. And so there are a
Yeah.
couple that I'm looking at really closely right now. One is a project by Redacted Cartel. And so they have a voting protocol called Butterfly. And that has done really well. But they're basically trying to get governance tokens and a voting block for these two other projects. One would be Olympus DAO. Olympus DAO is kind of like a basket of currency, of synthetic currencies, cryptocurrencies. And I read one analysis that
Yeah.
compared it to the IMF special drawing rights, so the IMF SDRs. And so the SDR is it's a basket of big international currencies that the IMF
Right.
will sometimes deposit into developing countries. And so Olympus DAO was kind of pitched as a crypto version of that. But instead of using um, you know big international currencies, they're using big cryptocurrencies. And so that one's taken
Mm.
off. And another one is Curve Finance. And so Curve Finance is an automated market maker, an AMM, and it is seamlessly handling transactions between two pairs of very, very closely related currencies. So the two stable coins that would be most associated with the dollar would be let's say USDC and DAI
Yeah.
makers. And so
Correct.
if for whatever reason you need to exchange those two, Curve Finance is the plumbing in the background that's doing that seamlessly. And the guy that did
Mm.
it is,
Okay.
a Russian quant. And so
Yeah.
like there are these parts of of decentralized finance where the smartest guys in the world figure out, okay, this is a very liquid market. And, if I provide the most liquidity and the best technological solution for, doing those trades,
Yeah.
that actually is pretty useful.
Well, you're bringing up an interesting point. I think a big portion of DeFi and just crypto in general, there's this whole idea of you still need to build out the infrastructure. How much of this infrastructure do you think still is missing in order for fiat to come shift from what we know as fiat of regular currencies we know over to cryptocurrencies, because essentially crypto is just shifting a fiat. That's all it is. But in order to support that, speeds need to increase. Belief needs to be there, and actual technology needs to be there. So how far are we away from having this enough infrastructure for this shift to happen, or do you think about it differently?
I would say the infrastructure here is the most advanced in the world. It is way more advanced than like the Swift banking system and whatever powers
Of
like
course.
your dad's brokerage account.
Okay.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
other thing too is like
Go ahead.
like I think this is what distinguishes me from a lot of people in the crypto community is I am not um philosophically or temperamentally against fiat currency. Right. So
Yep.
that was one of those things that actually probably slowed down my descent into crypto, is that like there were all these gold
Yeah.
bugs, all these people railing against fiat.
Yeah. Of course.
I'm
Of
never going to be
course.
one of those guys. In
Yeah.
terms of like what I'll say is there's going to be a lot of there's going to be incredible growth in crypto and crypto innovation. Um, but you can see a possibility where like both sides keep growing. Like fiat money is going to grow
Mm.
and crypto assets will grow.
I I kind of believe that's like, at least for the short and medium term. That's my belief, that they kind of grow in tandem. But I think at some point it's just like, everyone gets caught up to the point of mass adoption where it just, from an efficiency standpoint, from an actual physical standpoint, it just makes more sense. Just everyone just uses digital currency, because
Right.
what's the point of having actual coinage, right? It doesn't make sense.
Well, so this is my idea. So my idea with the IMF, and I mentioned this earlier, special drawing rights, the SDRs,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
SDRs, it would be more efficient and probably more reliable if there was like an SDR DAO. And so if you could get
Yeah.
enough smart crypto people together and you create a
Yeah.
synthetic version of the IMF currency and you sell it to the IMF.
Yeah.
So that's my
Well,
idea
there's
right
there's
now.
a bunch of people. But there's a bunch of people who already have created crypto ETFs and indexes. Because my sister has no clue what the hell any of this means, but she wants exposure in her portfolio, so she just kind of dumps some portion of her portfolio into these indexes. I mean, and so the thing is, the world is not defined of how it looks, whether it will be one coin, many coins, a basket of coins. And even how that even plays out, from region to region, or from, I don't know, from cluster to cluster, right? So it's possible that you could build a better index, like, I don't know, an index that's more representative of what the future is going to be, and then you can, in a sense, like, you build your own ETF, but for crypto, right? Or SDR, like you said. I mean, do you think that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean the ETF, I've seen these headlines and I'm thinking about you know, I guess when people are thinking about how the big traditional finance players will approach this, they'll approach it that way.
Yeah.
They'll try to
Correct.
build products for probably just Bitcoin and Ethereum early on that
Yeah.
people who are like, let's say 50 years old and above who want exposure can get it and will feel safe
Yeah.
doing it. Um,
Yeah.
I suspect the problem there is just going to be the fees. So like if you buy,
Yeah.
a lot of ETFs, the management fees are just not reasonable. And so
Correct.
my hunch is that like the fees are going to be unreasonable.
So that you just basically replicate the same thing, but on a blockchain, then, right?
And
So then
that
you
that
remove the
product almost
middleman, lower the costs.
already exists.
So the product already exists, you said?
I mean, I haven't gone looking for it, but like the mutual fund equivalent that the traditional players are
Yes.
probably going to be pushing on retail investors. That
Yeah.
the Yeah, like that product almost already exists somewhere else for lower fees.
Don't you think that these traditional institutional investors, when they finally wake up and get into it, and they are, institutional money already is getting into it, isn't that the first thing they're going to do, is replicate their products on it?
Replicate their products. Sorry, tell me more.
Right. So I mean, if you're a traditional fund, you just, buy an exchange, or buy, I don't know, some existing you know basket of coins that have mass adoption already, and then you just replicate your same, like, ETF products, but onto the blockchain instead. I mean, so in a sense, like, because the question is like, why don't you just go build it out, since you can't find it, right? But as an entrepreneur, but I guess the counter argument is, can't why can't these big guys just copy it and do it themselves later? Or
Copy,
you wouldn't be
copy,
worried about that?
copy what?
copy the idea of just building a more efficient ETF on a blockchain or these kind of mutual funds on a blockchain?
I mean, one obvious problem here is just manpower. Like,
That's true. I mean,
like
globally, right? I mean, it's
yeah, there aren't enough good blockchain engineers, and
correct.
for the most part,
Correct. Yeah.
the the good ones are not going to be going to traditional companies that are, that could have blockchain strategies that take 3 years to implement.
So if you're an investor, or say if you're a builder with the end sight of just wanting to have a successful startup or exit, right? The idea would be you would build that kind of mutual fund idea on a blockchain, but then with the idea of that later on you would be acquired by one of these big players because they couldn't do it.
Maybe. I mean, there was a Thai exchange that just got acquired for a ton of money from one of the big banks. But yeah, honestly, one of the reasons that got me like less interested initially was that, like, a lot of the business models that seem to have proliferated seem to have been exchanges and lenders. And so I was like, okay, I'm not
Yeah.
sure where I see the innovation. And now, because
Yeah.
of the blockchain games, and then like the probably the more esoteric DeFi products, like, I think now
Yeah.
I'm convinced. And I would say the ICO process itself is a major innovation.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess we talked a lot about the big macro context, and I guess for the last question, then because of time, but how, like, from a real tangible perspective, if we were to project this 10, 20, 30 years, what's the most tangible change or impact in the world from DeFi that you think that's going to completely, change how we do everything that we're doing today? That's different.
Oh man, that question is probably too big for me to handle. I think it's going to make. I think I think in terms of the DeFi fintech technology, like the fintech projects that aren't dealing that don't have kind of a blockchain element at its core, um, I imagine they're going to struggle.
Hmm.
I
Okay.
mean, like really,
All
like
right. Fair enough.
the plumbing technology, uh, the there's a reason so many exchanges are built on decentralized platforms, because,
Correct.
like, that's a very
Yeah.
interesting use case. And so one area where I probably didn't give
Yeah.
it enough credit early on. And so the
Yeah.
proliferation of
Okay.
AMMs, like automated market makers, um,
Yeah.
that's the cutting edge stuff seems to be, coming from blockchain guys. It's not coming from, traditional
No.
finance. Like, they're not thinking about it. If anything, they think it's
So
a
I mean,
cost center.
yeah. If I'm to extrapolate, your biggest conviction is probably just a revolution of the traditional financial markets where it's modernized through just everyone using blockchain essentially, right? Which
Or
means more participation, more access, less power to these centralized authorities, essentially.
Yeah, but also just kind of getting rid of, like, kind of relatively strange customs, like the New York trading hours thing drives me nuts.
Yeah, correct.
Like, why?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Why? There is no reason to be. What are the hours? Like 8 to 4
It's nine to five, 9 to 4.
for New
Well, four,
York?
four, yeah, like four.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that makes
correct.
no sense. Like, just make it 24
Yeah.
hours.
I mean, they do have a few exchanges that are 24 hours, but the traditional ones still exist for probably just tradition alone, which is ridiculous,
Yeah, that
which
makes.
produces massive amounts of liquidity and volume. So you're right, it's a bit weird. So I mean, if anyone, like, why should people get in contact with you? What do you want to plug anything or any final comments?
I mean, the final comments I think are for founders. Feel free to reach out to me if you've got a cool project and you want a fresh set of eyes to look at your white paper. I would take the process really seriously and use this as an organizing structure, for you to communicate with your team, and also for you to clarify your vision on what you want to do. I know this is a great opportunity to raise money, but for a lot of founders, you have no idea what the future looks like. So this may be, your one big chance to raise money.
Correct.
So,
Yeah.
if this is your one chance to build something meaningful, um, go big, think big. Uh,
Mm,
don't just try to be a clone of a clone of a clone. If you had some wider ambition that you think you can use this idea as a vehicle to attain, uh, you know, put it down in paper now. And one thing that I coach a lot of people on, is not being shy about their grandest ambitions, because this is something that not every day do people ask you, what's your vision? What's your dream? And this is a
yeah.
chance for you to do that. Uh, and
Hmm.
I'll tell you, as an investor or a future employee, or someone playing the game, I'm going to gravitate towards projects that have a big vision.
Yeah. Okay. And then how could they reach you?
Ask Alex.
Okay. You can contact me from here, and then I'll connect you to Don. Okay, great, Don. So thanks. All right. Thanks so much for your time, and I appreciate all the insights.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Bye.
Okay. Hey listeners, thank you for listening to Don's episode. If you enjoyed the content or learned something new, please share it with your friends and family or anyone who would benefit, and give us a review on your podcasting platform of choice. So what did we learn today? Crypto is booming in Vietnam. This comes from having real pain points that are unique to the Vietnam ecosystem, mixed in with the right talent that have unlocked opportunities for Vietnam that have been long coming, in my opinion. From early 2010, from the first e-commerce boom to the late decade, it feels like recognition has been slow from the investment community. The talent has always been there from a technical perspective, and Vietnam is further locking down this competitive advantage. The second wave of capital, talent, and entrepreneurship is even more substantial than ever, and we're finally seeing investment rounds and valuations that match the bold innovation ideas that are in the market. At the same time, personally, I know there's a lot of old world bureaucracy choking some deals, but that is where crypto holds great promise for countries like Vietnam, with tight controls, with great talent, and a hungry workforce. With a rapidly growing economy, for anyone interested in the Southeast Asia region, it would be a hard argument to make to overlook Vietnam and the potential impact it will have in the near future. See you guys back here for next week's episode. EOA out.